You are listening to the Intelligent Racer Podcast, where we look to educate and entertain the endurance racing community through discussions with racing professionals and elite age groupers.
In today's episode, I speak with pro triathlete James Cunnama. We talk about a wide range of triathlon racing topics that I think you'll find interesting and useful. I hope you enjoy. James, welcome to the podcast. How you doing today?
Oh, very good news.
Good. So why don't we start off with just briefly learning a little bit about your background. I was reading about you, and one thing I read was both your parents competed at Comrades, which is a very, very well-known race, and you obviously have a running background. So we'd love to hear a little bit about that, and if you ever do you have any future interest in doing Comrades?
Yeah, definitely. It's on the bucket list. It's been on the bucket list since I was about 5, I think. Yeah, I grew up in Pietermaritzburg, which is the Comrades host city. It's an up run or a down run every other year. So it's either the start of Comrades or it's the finish of Comrades every year.
Yeah.
And my parents did it. Each of them have done it, I think, 4 times. My brother actually ran it. It was a week ago. And my brother ran it for the 3rd time. And yeah, there's definitely a pang of jealousy there going, I've got to tick that off one of these days.
Oh yeah, for sure.
I then I grew up watching that, and endurance sport was absolutely part of my life. I ran from a very young age. I ran with my mom's running group. They were all slow plodders, but they ran long distances, and I used to run with them, and I used to run up the road and then turn around and come back and fetch them. But it got me out of bed early in the morning, and kind of, I guess, set the tone for a life of activity and training.
Yeah, and then how did you get introduced to triathlons?
I went and studied in Port Elizabeth, which is further down the South African coast, and studied sports science. And while I was there, I kind of decided to work on my running a little bit more, and some middle distance, some track. And I was in a running group, and one of the guys in the running group kind of drafted me into the volunteer ranks for the first Ironman. Was actually a half Ironman back then in 2005, I think it was, in Port Elizabeth. Drafted me into the volunteer ranks to close the roads and watch these crazy people do this crazy event. And the same guy then lent me a bike and said, you should try this. I was not really interested because swimming was not really my thing.
Yeah.
But I did a duathlon and really enjoyed it. Just the added challenge, the added dimension of having to bike and run off a bike was obviously very challenging and interesting for me, and that just went from there. The following year I volunteered again at the Ironman, and I got a little bit more into triathlon. I did a sprint distance, then I did a half Olympic distance. About 6 months later I did a half Ironman. And about a year after that, I did my first Ironman in 2007 at Port Elizabeth in South Africa. So it was a very quick move.
Yeah.
From one to the next. But I do think the challenge it really excited me. I'd spent a whole lifetime up to there, 20 years of running and trying to be a better runner. And suddenly there was this whole new dimension of things to work on. There were skills to learn. There was I had to learn to swim. I had to figure out biking. I remember my first ride where I rode over 100 kilometers, over 60, 70 miles. And just that feeling when you're a runner, you never cover more than 10 miles or 20 miles at a push.
Yeah.
And suddenly I'd gone and done 100 miles and seen the whole of my town and parts of my town I'd never seen before, before I even went to university that morning. It was just a whole new dimension, and I just took to it like a duck to water. I absolutely loved it. It was just this complete challenge. It challenged every part of me.
Yeah, for sure. That's definitely one of the draws and why I got into the sport myself. I'm obviously an amateur, but it definitely is a challenge and tons to learn. So let's talk about swimming for a second. So it sounds like you didn't have a swimming background, and obviously you had to learn what is a very nuanced technical sport. So, I mean, how did you go about doing that? And obviously, for me at least, it's a steep learning curve, hard to become a good swimmer if you don't have that deep swimming background. So I'm just curious how you were able to go from no swimming to becoming competitive at the professional triathlon level.
Yeah, the simple answer is hard work. it's the whole 10,000 hours to be good at something thing. Over the last 10 years, I've probably put close to that in to my swimming. It's been really, really difficult. I would definitely recommend you learn to swim when you're under 7, because it's hard to do it later on. Yeah, I started. I didn't have no swimming. I had done some swimming. Obviously, I grew up in South Africa, and it's hot and you swim, and we had a pool in our yard. So I spent a lot of time in the water, and I was comfortable in the water, but I had no swimming skill. I couldn't do a tumble turn. I didn't have any kind of stroke to speak of. So yeah, it's been a long and hard learning curve for me. That's been the biggest challenge, and also the most frustrating one. I think it is for most triathletes, because swimming improvements are not linear. With running, the more you run, the faster you run. Every race you get slightly faster. Every session you get slightly faster. You see better times, you see lower heart rates, that kind of thing. Whereas with swimming, it's not so linear. You can spend 6 months working really hard every day, very dedicated, and see almost no gains. And just at the point where you're getting frustrated, suddenly it kind of clicks, and you're suddenly swimming 7 or 8 seconds per 100 faster than you were swimming.
Right.
There's and that's a very frustrating thing when you're learning the sport. And then obviously there's the added frustration that when something happens that you can't swim, you spend a week or 2 weeks out of the pool, and it feels like you're back to square one. And that's also very frustrating with swimming. But those are the things that I've dealt with over the years, and it does take patience. It does take an awful lot of work, but it is doable. I was 21 and I didn't have a stroke to speak of, and now I'm swimming pretty much in the lead pack of most races. It is possible, but it's not the fun way to do it. I look at my wife who was a GB swimmer all her school career, and it just seems to come so easy for her.
Oh yeah.
Obviously. She's probably done many, many more hours of work than I have on swimming. She was up at 5 o'clock in the morning going swimming when I was going running, or I was sleeping in when I was a kid. So she's definitely paid the price for it, but I'm definitely jealous of her ability to get in the pool even after weeks out of the pool and just absolutely be smooth and great.
Oh yeah.
It's frustrating for a non-swimmer to look at that.
Oh yeah, I totally can relate. When I go to the pool and I'm with people who have the swimming backgrounds, competitive college, high school backgrounds, and they just get in there and they look so smooth, and I'm just battling. I'm like, oh man, I really wish I swam when I was younger. And of course,
I wish I could tell you that'll go away, but I'm afraid that's going to be with you for life.
Yeah, exactly. So you mentioned as you were getting into triathlons, you did a bunch of sprints, halves, ultimately Ironmans, and you're from South Africa. I'm from New York City. So obviously I know some of the larger races, Ironman, South Africa, and the 70.3, but what's the tri scene like over there? And, from an amateur and professional perspective, are there a lot of races? Is it a popular sport? I mean, how would you kind of describe it?
It's a popular sport, much like the rest of the world. It's seen quite a lot of growth in the last 10 years or so. And obviously South Africans are endurance sport mad. They always have been. We've got the biggest open water swim race in the world in the mid-mile, and the biggest time cycle race in the world in the Cape Argus cycle tour, and you mentioned already Comrades Marathon, which is the biggest ultra marathon in the world.
Yeah.
South Africans are endurance nuts, so obviously triathlon just speaks to that a lot. I think the scene, I was quite lucky where I got into it in Port Elizabeth with the addition of an Ironman there. Right about that time, there was a big boom in triathlon, and there were what they called development races every 3 or 4 weeks during the summer on the local beachfront. You swam in the sea, you rode down the coast road and turned around and came back. Not closed roads, not kind of heavily organized or sanctioned or anything like that. But it was something for you to go and test yourself at and meet other triathletes. And it was really, really good. And they still do that in various places around the country. And there has been a lot of growth in the number of races. There's a whole series of ultra triathlons, they call them, which are half Ironmans around the country. I did one recently in Sun City, which is where they have the Nedbank $1 Million golf tournament. It's a really great venue. And turning that kind of venue into a triathlon venue just, opens a whole new avenue, and a whole bunch of new people see it. So it is growing. It is good. I think one of the difficulties we have in South Africa is obviously the cost of triathlon. we're looking at a pretty brutal exchange rate, bringing bikes and bringing equipment in to South Africa, which makes it a little bit less accessible. An Ironman entry fee in South Africa is quite a whack compared to maybe in America where you're earning dollars. When you earn in rands, which are, I think currently it's 13 rand to a dollar. That's that exchange rate, and also obviously bringing in all equipment is brought in from overseas, bikes and wheels and components and all that kind of stuff that you need for a pretty expensive sport to begin with. That is a challenge, and I think that's probably the only thing hindering the growth. I think it would be an absolutely massive sport in South Africa without that cost difficulty.
Yeah, that's definitely a problem for sure, an obstacle. And even in the U.S. where we're buying a lot of domestic equipment and obviously paying U.S. dollar rates for these races, it's still very expensive. So I can only imagine.
Yeah,
so
absolutely. So
recently, not too long ago, you podiumed at the Ironman 70.3 Switzerland race. So can you just talk about that a little?
Yeah, it's kind of a test to start my season almost, I guess, or at least start my Northern Hemisphere summer season. I feel like I've been racing since January with 70.3 South Africa. But I made some pretty big changes after Ironman South Africa didn't go very well for me in April. I rejoined my coach, Brett Sutton, who coached me 3.5 years ago for a good 5 years and coached me to fourth place at Ironman World Champs in 2013 before we parted ways. So I rejoined him after a few frustrating races and not quite getting the level that I was hoping for. And so this race at Rapperswil was kind of the first real test. I'd done a couple of other races, but they were more training. There was no tapering. There was no kind of focus on it. It was just kind of, let's go see where you are. And this was the first time I went in there, let's give this a good go, really, really try and smash it and see where we are. And it went really well. I had a very comfortable swim, swimming on the feet of some strong guys. I had a very good power numbers on the bike, and I was able to get off and run a 1:13 half marathon off that really hard bike.
Wow.
Unfortunately, it was only good enough for second, mostly because I messed up in T1. I grabbed the wrong transition bag, ran into the tent and turned it upside down, and someone else's helmet fell out.
Oh, no. That's not good.
Which was a bit frustrating. I had to put the helmet back in. Obviously, I didn't want to ruin someone else's race. So I had to put their helmet back in, run back to the rack, rehang theirs up in the right place, and then get mine, which cost me a few seconds and pretty much cost me the group on the bike, which meant I rode the whole bike on my own. But, that's racing, and it's better to get those gremlins out in these test races.
Oh, yeah.
Before the big ones come up. Obviously, the next big one is Ironman Frankfurt in a month or so.
Yeah. Cool. So in terms of training, I'm just curious how it's evolved for you over your career versus, when you first turned pro to now. And you mentioned that you worked with, the legendary coach, Brett Sutton, and then you went on your way, and then you came back to Brett and just sort of, obviously he has his own coaching style and philosophy. I'm just curious to hear how that evolution kind of happened for you and how you train today versus when you first started.
When I first started, I was coaching myself. And I was pretty much doing it out of magazines and on the back of my own sports science degree. There's basic principles that I had learned in my degree and just kind of applied them to myself, essentially. Principles of recovery and intensity and specificity and that kind of thing. And then reading a lot of magazines and books and that kind of thing. And it got me pretty far. Well, it got me the first couple of years, got me to 10th at Ironman South Africa before I joined Brett Sutton at the end of 2008. I joined Brett Sutton, and obviously, as you say, his coaching philosophies are something different. He has his own way, and that pretty much was what I took to be normal, I guess. It was basically he just indoctrinated me into his theories of how much hard work you do and how hard you work and how you build your season and your race and how you build through races and how you taper for races and that kind of thing. That was my normal, and I don't think it was anything like normal. So obviously after a few years when I did leave him, it was very difficult to find what normal was. I had various different coaches I tried and various different philosophies I tried racing less and doing just a few races a year and really peaking for them. And I tried racing like I was with Brett, racing regularly. And neither of those I didn't really get either of them right, to be honest. I had a few really good races, but I also had some races that should have been really good and just weren't. They just, didn't come together. So it's been quite a process, and I think at the moment it's kind of almost come full circle. Brett has changed over the years, mellowed somewhat. He's not quite as crazy and quite as much of a dictator, perhaps, as he used to be. He used to be very authoritarian. There wasn't much discussion. It was my way or the highway, and there was no, this is what you do. We're not discussing it, just do it. And now it's a bit more of a collaboration to get the best out of myself and to get the best out of his athletes. And I think that's a balance that's I've needed, being a bit more of an older, mature athlete. But I think it works well for him too. Yeah, there's a little bit less kind of control on his part. He can be a bit more relaxed and share the journey a bit more rather than just being authoritarian the whole time.
Right.
So right now we're in a very good place. Hopefully that turns into some good results.
Right. And you mentioned, I guess Brett's philosophy is to race regularly, like you said. And so you obviously have A races, and then you have races, like you said earlier in the season, that are really just training days. Are you able to hold back and sort of really kind of maintain yourself and say, this is not the day I'm out here to win the race. I'm here. This is a training day.
I don't think we were ever really allowed to do that, to be honest. I think the difference is that it's not there. If Brett sends me to a race for training, it's not a case of holding myself back. It's a case of I'm not tapered. I am probably tired from training. I may or may not feel good. We haven't peaked for this race. So it's not really a case of not giving it 100% and not smashing myself. It's more a case of not knowing exactly what James is going to turn up on the day, right, and not worrying about what James turns up on the day. If it's not going great, if it's not going well, you get a solid 4 or 5 hours of work in and get back to work the next day kind of thing. And you haven't lost anything. So it's more of a mental approach to a race rather than actually the approach of the physical approach of how much effort I put in. The training races, as we call them, are still very much very hard efforts. It's a half Ironman is still a 4 hours at pretty much as hard as I can push. But if I get beaten, there's no like, oh well, I should not have been beaten by that person. It's more a case of, well, it was good training and I was not peaked and I was not tapered and I was not fresh, and I still got a very solid day out of it. That's the difference, really. We don't go to races and give a half effort,
right,
ever.
Right.
Essentially, when we call it a training race, you can get more out of a training race when you've got aid stations, you've got closed roads, you've got that kind of thing. So we can give a good 100% effort to the session, which you couldn't do in training, where you've got stoplights and you've got circles and you've got traffic and you're going to have to stop at a gas station somewhere and fill up your bottles, that kind of thing. So that's kind of how he treats training races.
Okay. Yeah. No, that makes sense. So it's more of a expectation setting or kind of the mental aspect during the race. And so you mentioned tapering, and that's obviously something that is very kind of individual, what works for each person. I'm curious, sort of, what is your approach to tapering? It's something that from an amateur perspective, we kind of struggle with a little bit because we either do too much or too little. So it's sort of a more of an art than a science. I would love to hear your opinion on it.
Yeah, it is, you say, very individual. I've tried everything from, the big 3-week out taper and been extremely fresh for race day, all the way through to, like Rappersville recently, where we literally, Daniela Arif and I literally swam 4.5 Ks the day before, got in the car afterwards and drove to the race venue, and then did an hour ride when we got there. And then the next morning woke up and did a race. There was literally no taper to speak of. And everything in between. It is very individual. I think, like I say, it very much depends on what your goals are. If you can afford to not taper and train through it, you can get very much fitter from a race. If it's an important race, then obviously you want the best you to show up, and the best way to guarantee that is to make sure you're fairly fresh on race day. Having said that, though, most people probably over taper in our sport. It is a very aerobic sport. We're not dealing with massive muscle damage from training day in and day out, and we're not dealing with massive levels of fatigue day in and day out. It's aerobic, and the race is aerobic also. You're not pushing at 95% of your maximum at any point in a half Ironman or an Ironman. So keeping that aerobic fitness all the way through to the day, keeping moving, keeping your body moving, and keeping your heart rate going and your aerobic fitness up all the way through to race day is generally the best strategy for everyone, even if it means getting to the race a little bit less fresh than you might otherwise do. Most people go into race day, and if they're too fresh, they end up blowing up because they push too hard at the start of the bike or too hard at the start of the run because they feel so good. But it's still a very long run and still a very long bike. So it's almost better sometimes to be a little bit less fresh so you don't feel so good and you build into your day rather than the opposite.
Yeah, no, that certainly makes sense. And do you have a routine for sort of the day before and the day of the race in terms of the kind of the stuff the day before to kind of freshen up, and then also the warm up before the race? Do you do some running and swimming as well?
Yeah, it depends on the race. It depends on the situation. Generally, the race itself dictates what you can and can't do the day before and the day of. Sometimes you're traveling to the race start and you can't do a swim warm up. They only allow a dry land warm up and that kind of thing. And sometimes there's ample facilities to do a proper warm up in the morning. So it does vary. But generally some kind of movement. If I can't do a swim, I'll do a jog an hour or two before the race starts. The day before also is very much dictated by the race. So you've got bike check-in at a certain time. You've got pro briefing. You've got that kind of thing that you have to do at certain times. So you've got to fit the other things. A little swim, a little bike, a little run is generally what I try and do the day before a race, just to get loose and stay loose. But that also is very much dependent on when you have to get your bike into transition and where you have to travel to and that kind of thing. So yeah, I do try and keep a routine. But I think generally the main things I control the day before the race are hydration and nutrition. The day before the race, obviously, those are going to affect your race day more than doing a little swim or a little bike or a little bit of movement and that kind of thing. If you can keep your hydration and nutrition right the day before, then you're better prepared for the next day, regardless of whether you've done a little jog or you've done a swim or you've done a spin out on your bike, which you may not be able to do when you've got bike check-in and stuff to deal with.
Right. And so, the day before the race, obviously it's an individual thing. It's going to depend on the weather and all that kind of thing. But I mean, how much hydration are you trying to do? Because there's obviously too much hydration where you flush out all of the electrolytes in your system and there's too little. But is there a specific way you're measuring that? Or is it just sort of kind of drink with thirst and just make sure you are drinking throughout the day?
Drink with thirst generally. Make sure you have something around and make sure you're drinking, all day before the day before the race is very important to make sure you're not a camel, you can't store fluid.
Yeah.
But you don't want to get to race day overhydrated, and holding water, but you also don't want to get there dehydrated in any way, because you are going to get dehydrated throughout the race day itself. So it's important that you're drinking electrolyte drinks the day before and making sure that your fluid balance is right. Maybe hydration is probably the wrong word for it, but your fluid balance, you want the right balance of salts and fluid.
Right.
You don't want to drink tons of water the day before the race and flush out all your salts, because that's going to be as bad as being dehydrated. But similarly, you don't want to not drink all day the day before the race and be dehydrated on race morning. So yeah, it's finding that balance. And the same with nutrition. You need to be eating so that you've got the energy on race morning, but you don't want to be eating so much that the next morning you have stomach issues when you're running.
Yeah.
So it's those balances and figuring out what's right for you. Obviously, that also changes in different environments. A cold race is a very different situation to a hot race, as far as your nutrition and your hydration goes.
Moving to another topic here, your wife is also a professional triathlete, and I'm curious to hear, did train and race together. She's now expecting, so congratulations on that. That's awesome news.
Thanks.
And so, how's that dynamic changed now that she's not racing this, this season, and you are? Probably stressful for her to sit on the sidelines to watch. I know my wife's in the same exact situation where we used to both as amateurs race, and now she's stressing out on the sidelines. I'm like, relax, it's fine. But I'm just curious to hear a little bit about that dynamic.
Yeah, very much. We met on camp with Brett Sutton. We were on the same team 6-7 years ago. That was how we met, and we've done a lot of traveling together, a lot of racing together, and a lot of training together over the years. And yeah, it is a very big adjustment for her at the moment. She has been essentially an elite athlete for 20 years. She was a GB swimmer and a GB cross country runner for Great Britain and in school, and then got pretty much headhunted for their triathlon program. Went to the Olympics in Athens in 2004. So she's been doing it for many, many years and not really ever stepped away from it. She hasn't taken a year off. She hasn't taken a season off over all those years. So this is a bit of an adjustment for her, and obviously having me needing to go and race and go to training camps and stuff like that is pretty difficult for her. She's currently in the UK. We've been apart now for a few weeks while I'm at camp in St. Moritz. She's in the UK. She'll be heading back to South Africa soon, and thereafter she can't really travel. So then it'll be a matter of me going back home, training at home when I can. Obviously it's winter in South Africa, but we've got pretty good facilities to train in Stellenbosch in South Africa, and then traveling to camps and traveling back home as quick as possible. So it's a bit of an adjustment for both of us. At this point, obviously, a bit more of an adjustment for her because I'm still carrying on with my season. But not having her with me, traveling to races and traveling to camps, as we have had for the last 5 or 6 years, is also an adjustment. I'm here in St. Moritz without my wife, which is not ideal. And at the moment, we're just seeing it as one of those sacrifices that we have to make for the season's goals.
Right. And I guess this is goes without saying, but when after a child's born, you're going to make sure he or she is swimming early in life, I would assume, right?
Yeah. I obviously have interest in making sure they can swim if they do choose to go the triathlon route, because I don't want them to go through what I've gone through.
Yeah, exactly.
Jody obviously feels like swimming is part of a normal child's upbringing. Start going to swimming at 5 o'clock in the morning because that's her own upbringing. So yeah, there's a pretty good chance our kid will be going to swim squad from an early age. But yeah, whether they choose triathlon or any other sport, we will obviously support them. We know not necessarily going to push them into triathlon. With any luck, the pro sport of triathlon will have developed somewhat in coming years, a bit more of a professional sport, a bit more of a career than a journeyman's career as it is at the moment.
Yeah.
No one's earning golf money, but yeah, an active kid is definitely on the way. What sports they choose to be active in is completely up to them.
Right. No, that makes sense. And I have the same plans for my kid is get him in the pool early because I've suffered long and hard. So
Yeah.
So one final question. So we talked a little bit about Ironman Frankfurt. I mean, what else is on tap for 2017? How does the rest of your season look? How is it going to unfold?
The plan at the moment is somewhat fluid. It sounds a bit weird, a professional athlete saying, I don't really know what my plan is for the season. But this season, that is almost exactly the situation. As I said, I joined Brett 2 months ago. It very much depends on Frankfurt. If I do well in Frankfurt, if I get a top 5 there, that will seal my qualification for Ironman World Champs in Kona in October. And we will direct the season towards that. If that doesn't go as planned or doesn't go as well, we may do the long-term plan for Kona, which is skip Kona this year, get an early qualification race or 2 in, hopefully before the baby arrives, and seal the qualification for the following year nice and early so we can spend the whole year next year focusing just on getting ready for Kona rather than chasing points and chasing qualification. Obviously, with the beginning of this year not going so well with Ironman South Africa, I'm a little bit on the back foot as far as qualification goes. So it's kind of fluid at the moment, and we're taking our season as it comes. But certainly, it'll be Ironman Frankfurt and then a few more races, whether they are races in training for Kona or whether they are races to make some money and to qualify early for the following year's Kona remains to be seen.
Awesome. Well, that sounds like a good plan, and I'll definitely be tracking you at Frankfurt and the other races. So best of luck with the rest of 2017. And obviously for both you and Jody, congratulations on expecting and best of luck with everything, and hope the rest of your season goes great. So thanks again for your time today.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to the Intelligent Racer podcast. For more information on this and other episodes, please visit www.intelligentracer.com. Also, be sure to check us out on social media, and please review us on your podcast directory. Join us next time for another edition of the Intelligent Racer.